Welcome to the Providence College podcast. Subscribe to the show on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, and Google Play. If you like what you hear, please review and share with others. Email podcast@providence.edu with questions or comments. Go Friars!
Hello and welcome to the Providence College podcast. I'm your host, Matt Chittum, and I'm joined as always by PC producer and videographer Chris Judge, class of 05. Here at the Providence College podcast, it's our job to bring you interesting stories from people in and around the Friar family. And today is a new episode for the podcast. We have two people joining me today. The first time we've had more than one other mic on the other side of the table. So we have Dr. Jennifer Illuzzi. Also, we have Dr. Arthur Urbano. Thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure
Thanks
to be
for
here.
having us.
This is great. I know we're going to have senior Joey Aiello joining us as well. He can't make it, unfortunately. He's doing his grad school thing. So hopefully we can have him on later. But again, like I said, thank you for joining us. This is wonderful.
Great.
So you guys you do a lot of things on campus, but most recently you're putting a lot of your time and effort into the Jewish Catholic Theological Exchange. Arthur, what exactly is that?
Good question. So the Jewish Catholic Theological Exchange is a committee in the theology department. It was established around 2008 or so. After I initially became involved in and interested in Jewish Catholic interreligious dialogue. It's not an area that I was academically trained in, but it was kind of a work or a vocation, if you will, to use theology speak, that kind of found me. There was a local rabbi in Cranston, Rabbi Peter Stein, who was new to the area at the time and was looking to sort of engage Catholics in various interreligious activities. He approached the college. It came my way. It was something that I was interested in, and to sweeten the pot, he and I went to a conference at the Vatican to get things started.
Wow. That's a pretty good perk of the job.
Yeah, it really is. And anybody who knows me, any opportunity to go to Rome, I never say no. And this was definitely a worthy cause, and it was a really, really inspiring conference, and it's really what planted the seed for me of the interest in interreligious dialogue.
So why did it fall to you when this rabbi reached out to the school?
Well, he initially reached out to the diocese, Bishop Tobin, and Bishop Tobin sent him over to the college because he knew that Dr. Sandra Keating, who was the director of WWII and a member of the theology department, was active specifically in Muslim Catholic dialogue. And at the time, she was pretty busy, so she asked me if I would be interested in doing it. And I mean, really, for me, I studied the New Testament, I studied the early church, and there is a lot of Christian Jewish engagement in those early decades. So I wouldn't say I had no training, but I had sort of no experience in contemporary issues. So I kind of had this foundation to work on. And really seized the opportunity to do it.
And it really got going in 2009.
Yeah. So we kind of did, we set up a committee to explore different options on how to engage the campus community, engage students, faculty, and so on. And we kind of had a couple of test lectures in 2008. In fact, our very first speaker, Father Dennis McManus, came in 2008, and he was actually here the other night, returning 9 years later. He was very impressed with how things had developed in those 9 years, but we officially kicked off the series in 2009. Got it.
And it has come a long way. Talk about how it started, and it kind of started in a way that it's funny how it began with an outsider coming to the school as a way of starting the project, as opposed to coming in from the inside and germinating more organically within the college itself. But at the same time, no matter how it started, it really has taken hold. I mean, even this semester, we had, I'm sorry, not this semester, but this year, Cardinal Dolan was on campus. Yeah. And obviously that must have been a pretty big deal for not just the campus community generally, but for the JCTE program specifically.
Oh, absolutely. That's definitely our highlight. We've always pulled a good audience, 75 to 100 people on a semester basis. But I mean, we filled St. Dominic Chapel. I think by some counts there were about 700 people there to come hear Cardinal Dolan. And I mean, people from the Catholic community, people from the Jewish community, people from other communities, the seminarians of the Diocese of Providence were here. a lot of students. So, yeah, it was really a fantastic event. And Cardinal Dolan's done a lot of good work in fostering Catholic-Jewish relations.
And a dynamic speaker, too. And for the people who weren't there or haven't heard about it, the title of the talk was Jewish-Catholic Dialogue, 2,000 Years, but Just Beginning. So you're housed in the theology department. And that's kind of how the JCTE piece got kicked off. Jen, you're not in theology. You're in the history department. So how did it come your way?
Well, so I'm not directly involved in the JCTE programming. However, Arthur came to me several years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago.
So, yeah.
And it said that he had begun working on a project to study the history of Jewish students at Providence College. And I said, there were Jewish students at Providence College? And he said, yes, more than you would think. And he said, in fact, there are so many and there's so much to look at that I need help with this project. So I agreed to help him out, even though I said, well, you realize I studied the history of modern Germany and Italy and don't really know anything about American Jewish history. And he said, well, I need a historian to work with me. And I said, well, it's something I'd be really interested in doing. So he said, well, I found more information than I can deal with alone, so we can start working on it together. So that was about, I think, 3 or 4 years ago now, and we've been working on it since, and I've learned a ton. I've always been interested in diaspora populations, and I have studied the history of the Jewish diaspora in Europe, but this is my first real significant study of a Jewish population in the U.S., and particularly in Rhode Island. I'm not from Rhode Island, so it's all kind of new to me and fascinating.
So when you started all of this research, did you have an end goal in mind in terms of what you wanted to produce with the findings, or did it kind of come through just a kind of a more organic process of this is what we have and these are different ways to showcase what we found?
I think it kept growing.
Yeah.
I think initially the plan was to have some kind of exhibit on campus and perhaps produce a documentary, because we knew we were going to be doing oral history interviews. But that's grown to a longer documentary and a bigger exhibit. And then we're also doing an online exhibit. And eventually we'd like to publish an article from our research. So it kind of keeps growing on us.
So the documentary, so next Thursday, which is March 30th, this is going to come out the following Monday from today. So when people hear this, the documentary might be coming up in a day or two. So with that in mind, what exactly is that, and what can people see next Thursday when that comes to bear?
Sure. So over the past few years, we've been, as Jen said, we've been sort of recording oral histories of guys who were here at PC, some as early as the late 1930s. All right, so there was one gentleman we interviewed who was nearly 101 years old at the time we interviewed him. He recently passed away, unfortunately. But he came into PC, I think, in 1932. So when you think about it, the school was, barely 20 years old at the time. And here we are celebrating our centennial, and we were able to talk to him. So we talked to basically guys who were here from the 30s through the 60s, some other people as well. We talked to some historians, some later alums as well. And the documentary, what we're going to be showing on Thursday is kind of a short 10-minute version of what we'll continue to produce over the course of this year. And we got a generous grant from the Rhode Island Foundation. And we also got a CAFR grant on campus to actually do this work, because neither one of us are film producers either. So it's a whole. It's really been a learning process in a lot of ways. So on Thursday we'll be showing kind of a short version that kind of summarizes some of the main topics and some of the key interviews that will be eventually in the larger film.
And do you have any idea when the larger film will be coming out?
Hopefully by the end of the summer is the goal.
Yeah.
Got it. So did you find any, obviously you don't want to give away the whole thing, you don't want to tell people exactly what's in it before they actually see it, but at the same time, you must have come up with some very interesting stories. I mean, come across some very interesting stories from these people. So did you have any common themes that, that either you came into it knowing that they might have existed, or that came through later researching what you'd seen in those interviews?
Well, I'd say the big theme that has come through basically in the whole project for me is that the story of Jewish students at PC is the story of Smith Hill. It's the story of this neighborhood and how it's evolved and changed over time. And so that's, I would say, the big theme that comes through in the film and the exhibit for me as a historian, and what I found really interesting about this work.
Got it. So most of the people, just like the history of the college itself, many of the Jewish students who attended PC in the beginning part of the century came to PC because they lived in close proximity. You could walk here and could fit it into their daily life. Mm-hmm. Got it. Yes. All right, that makes sense. Yeah. So, and you see now, obviously, the PC's population is very different. We have a much smaller Rhode Island population within the school itself, and we draw from throughout the region. It's just the college admissions process obviously is vastly different than it was at that time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Most of when we spoke to the guys about what was the application process, most of them said, I have no idea. I think I just showed up.
Yeah.
I don't really remember writing anything down.
Yeah.
I think I talked to the guy in charge and he said, show up. And that was kind of the end of it. So very different process than today.
Right. Do these people, I know this is generally speaking, but do they have a lasting attachment to the school? Or is it kind of case-by-case basis with that sort of thing?
Well, the guys we spoke to, some of them had told us that they hadn't set foot on campus in like 40 years or something like that, and some of them only live in Warwick. It's very Rhode Island, and I'm from Rhode Island, so I know the culture. But nevertheless, when they spoke about their experience here, it was very full of fondness and good memories. And I was especially struck by the way many of them spoke about the Dominicans who were here. And in certain cases, some of them had developed very strong friendships that lasted beyond their years as students here at PC with several of the Dominicans. And, we refer to them as father. What leapt out, if I had to choose one theme that kind of leaps out for me from kind of a theology perspective on things, it's also historical, I would say, from my perspective, that in thinking about the history and the identity of this college, I think one thing that stood out for me is that this wasn't a particular population that was just kind of incidentally here at PC. They were here at a very formative period. They were very active in student life, and they really contributed to what this college is in its earliest decades. They were in sports, they were in student leadership. All of these things really played a vital role in what this college is and the identity of the college.
Which begs the question that how does someone's faith in that context affect their college experience when they're attending a Catholic school? In a Catholic school, I guess let me put it this way. As a major gift officer, I have the chance to talk to a lot of non-alumni parents. So people who only know the school through their kids. And for a lot of them, they talk about how one of the reasons that their child or children attended PC was because they felt like it was Catholic all the way through, in terms of it wasn't just Catholic in name only. Right, that they kind of the school lived its Catholic mission and identity, and they viewed that in a very positive light. So when you look at that piece of the school, and obviously it's been a foundational element of the college, and then you have this other piece as well, like you just mentioned. It's great that those two can mesh in a kind of a seamless way for a lot of these individuals. Was that a surprise for you as you were going through this?
Well, I actually think those two things worked together. They actually enhanced one another in really important ways. And for most of the guys we talked to, they've recalled fondly carrying around the Summa on campus. And for a lot of them, it was a way that they strengthened their own faith. Because in some ways, right, there's a faith strengthening component in having to understand your faith in relationship to another faith. It forces you to understand your own faith and your own position in much stronger ways than you would if you didn't face that kind of conversation. And so many of the guys did remember having conversations with their professors or with Dominicans on campus about theological differences. And the Dominicans were very respectful of theological differences, as far as we could tell, in most cases. And so, we had a story of a guy who said, I was always asked to, I'm trying to remember the details of the story, but he would always get asked Old Testament questions in class as if he would know the answer.
And he said whatever he said was right. He was always right.
Right.
And he said, I was right because I was Jewish. That's what they told me.
Yeah. So, I mean, for most of the people here, it was not, at least the people we interviewed. And it's important to remember, we sent out calls. We asked various Jewish organizations, if you're an alumni, if you know an alumni, come talk to us. And so there's a self-selection bias here, too, that the people who came to talk to us were people who really liked the place, who were interested in our project. So that shapes the kinds of interviews we held. But for the most part, they really found that the fact that it was a Catholic institution, if anything, strengthened their own faith.
And I think one thing that really surprised me in this project was going beyond the students and looking at the leadership of the college at the time, several of the presidents. And I think the discovery of this, what I'm about to say, was kind of what led to my interest in doing this project as a major project. When I first became involved in the JCTE, so this is how it all kind of links together, I started having conversations with different people attending the lectures who would say, there was a time when there were a lot of Jewish students at PC. Oh, really? And I kept hearing this. And so as I started, asking archives, do you have any, records? And I'd get this and I'd get that. But one thing that came across my desk was that in 1932, right? Now you really have to think about what was going on in the world in 1932, especially in Europe, especially with anti-Semitism. Ku Klux Klan was on the rise in the U.S. There was a conference here at Providence College where you had Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant speakers on the same stage talking about religious tolerance, religious difference, intermarriage, quota systems, all sorts of things. This was 30 years before the Catholic Church officially entered into religious dialogue with Vatican II. Things were leading up to it, and I see this as part of one of those things leading up to it. But President Lorenzo McCarthy, who was president in the late 20s into the 30s, he was a major figure behind this conference. And he was president when you had the highest number of Jewish students on campus. And then even following him into the 40s and even in the 60s when Vatican II was going on, this college was having conferences specifically on Jewish Catholic engagement. And I was really blown away by that, that the school was so formally involved at the top, and that you also kind of had a student body that reflected the interest in that. So that's very interesting. So do you think that the decisions by the presidents on senior level administration to go down that path of that early theological exchange and really talking about, hot button issues that can get a rise out of people on one side or the other, do you think that they were spurred on to do that because they saw society at large potentially grappling with those issues? Or was it more grassroots, like, hey, we have kids in this campus that are interested in this, and we're going to talk about this? Well, I think it's grassroots. We got to remember, too, Catholics at that time were also a population that was largely discriminated against. They were immigrants. Jews were immigrants. I mentioned at the talk the other night that in the 20s, the Ku Klux Klan burned a cross down here on the corner of Eaton Street and River Avenue, right in front of the college, when they were dedicating LaSalle Academy. It was a way of saying, you Catholics who are immigrants aren't welcome here, and we don't want you here. The Jews fell into that category too. So there was really, I think one of the main motivations was this bond that the Irish Catholics, the Italian Catholics who were here as well, and the Jews in the community really felt that they had to stand together as a minority, marginalized population.
So a lot of solidarity in being kind of an outsider population in that regard.
Yes, it's also important to remember that there were tensions between the Catholic and Jewish communities in Providence as well. So we had some stories of, when kids, in Smith Hill, there was kind of a demarcation between the Jewish area of Smith Hill and the Irish and the Italian sections of Smith Hill. And sometimes kids going to school at the local Catholic school might get into fights with some of the Jewish kids heading to public school. So it wasn't that everything was wonderful and relations were always good. There was certainly some levels of anti-Semitism, which was common at the time. However, most people noted that when they got here to campus, they did not experience that kind of rhetoric about killing Christ or on campus. So while they might have experienced it in the wider world, it didn't seem to be a huge factor for most people who got here to campus. So I think there was also a different tone set here as opposed to in the wider city or even in the neighborhood.
Interesting. This whole conversation is so interesting, I think, in part because how it plays out at a local level in regards to how it potentially mirrors the history of not just the United States, but our interplay with Europe and everything that's going on over there at that time, as you mentioned before. And I think also that whole idea of getting into the war at that time, that was a very politically wrought question. That was not anything. In retrospect, it's easy to people to assume, well, like, of course, U.S. got into the war. There was atrocities happening, and we injected ourselves into that situation. But it wasn't quite as simple as that. So did you have anything in regards to that topic in your interviews or the film itself in terms of U.S.'s involvement in World War II?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, you had, several of the people that we interviewed were in the service. Either they volunteered or were drafted. And even, we looked a lot at student publications, the Cowl and the Alembic at the time. And I was also really struck at student awareness of global issues at that time. I mean, there was a lot of talk about the war in the Cowl and so on. And in one of the very first editions of the Cowl, there was a survey on campus about whether the U.S. should participate in the Olympics in Germany. And there was the editor of the Cowl at the time was very much in favor of it. But what's very interesting, I think it's like the second, the second pub. Yeah. A Jewish student, one of the Jewish students on campus wrote in responding to the editor and basically said, I think your opinion is wrong. We shouldn't go over there. Hitler is treating my people terribly. And Catholics should watch out because they're next on the list. Basically is what he said. So, there was student awareness. There was debate on campus. Differing opinions, obviously, and in certain cases, some of these Jewish students were pretty vocal about what was going on.
That's a great point. And also, it's one of those topics on college and university campuses that is never going to die. It's the idea of civil discourse. Every college has its own culture and its own kind of political leanings, generally speaking, knowing that every person associated with the college has their own individual insights. But it also brings up a point of how to address certain topics and certain speakers in a way that's respectful yet critical. You're always questioning but doing it in a way that I think that we can be proud of later on. So is that something that, as you look through this, that you kind of could put, take from history and put it into more common or more, not common, but the current landscape of this topic?
I'd actually say, our project, at least what we're presenting next week, goes up into the 60s till 1965. And campus in the early 60s was not so civil. And so I think in some ways it's that time period is more comparable than the pre-World War II time period. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of upheaval on campus. There was a lot of debate about social norms on campus, the idea of wearing suits to class, about whether or not you could grow a beard, about the rules for having girls in dorms, about Vietnam. So there's a lot of serious upheaval and debate and protests on campus. And Father Haas was president at the time, and he really sought to keep discourse civil time and time again. And I think he did a good job of in some ways keeping a line of communication open with students that allowed them to be heard. And while it didn't get rid of protests, which it probably shouldn't have, right? It kept the protests, it kept a line of communication open so things didn't blow up. And I was very impressed by that at the time. But certainly the kinds of upheavals that are going on now in our society, I think, are very parallel to what was happening in the 60s, kind of challenges to social norms and ways of behavior that we came across in our project. But by the early 60s, from what we can tell, there was many fewer Jewish students on campus, which is also an interesting development. And in terms of our research, the reason we knew who was Jewish in the early years of the college was when they would come in and register, they would be asked what parish they belonged to. Obviously, they didn't belong to a parish, but many of them would either say Jewish or they would give us the name of their synagogue. And that would be recorded on their transcript. And that stopped happening in 1950. So after 1950, our research gets much murkier because we can't tell who's Jewish anymore. But for the 30s and 40s, it's very easy to tell who's Jewish from their transcripts. So, when we get to a period of the 60s, we're not as sure about how many students were on campus, but we did interview some alumni from that time period and get their experiences on campus. So.
Got it. So when you're talking about this, the documentary and the film that's going to come out later, and all of that, what's your, each of you, I'd love to hear this, your favorite story that you like to tell about, either someone that you interviewed with or when someone asked you about it, like something that gets you excited about the project itself? Arthur, I'll start with you.
Okay. Trying to choose one.
Yeah.
I had several favorite interviews. I think my favorite interview was with Leonard Scholes, who was this gentleman who was 100 years old. And it was just really an honor to meet him and to know that, when I would mention someone like, did you know Father McCarthy? I mean, we were talking about the president of the college in 1927. He's like, oh yeah, I remember him. I mean, someone that's still alive that remembers, people that who are historical figures to us. But the stories he told were so vivid. And jovial in a lot of ways. He had he had memories about his classes and so on. But he would talk about, his family was in the roller skating business. They had a roller skating rink, and they would hold events up here, and some of the Dominicans would take part in the roller skating. So, I forget who told us. Someone else was telling us about one of the Dominicans who had a motorcycle who would ride around town. These are just great stories, not only about the college and the Dominicans, but it also goes to show that, these guys just felt like they were just part of the school's life. And I think the really important contrast is scholars have done a lot of work studying the Jewish experience in the Ivy Leagues. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and so on. And what we've found is the experience was very different. There were attempts to exclude Jewish students in the Ivy Leagues. This is in the same period. Keep them out of clubs. State that that they're a danger to the character of Harvard or Yale. And that's really what drove a lot of these students here in the first place. It's one of the reasons. But really that contrast, to hear these kinds of stories where they just felt part of the life here was really impressive to me. Yeah.
Scholes sticks in my head.
I was going to say, did I steal Scholes from you?
That's okay. That's okay. So let me tell you. So my favorite story, I think, and this isn't from an interview necessarily, although I have some good interview stories in my head too, but. We had a senior in the history department was helping us do research on the project, and we've been working very closely with the Rhode Island Jewish Historical Society and their archives. And she had gone to the archive to find some pictures of Jewish life in Providence at the time, and she found this picture of a choir, Sons of Zion.
Yeah.
Right. The Sons of Zion Choir, which was a local congregation here in the north end of Providence. And there's a picture of the choir leader, who was a very well-known and respected man in the Jewish community, whose name was Meyer Smith. He had in the choir, 3 of the choir members. I was looking at their names on the back, and I thought, I know these guys. They're on our list. And so, in fact, 3 of the 5 boys in the choir had gone to Providence College. And there's this picture of all of them as young boys. And 2 of them were sons of Meyer Smith, and the third one was their neighbor. And it turns, so I started looking into this story, and the guys had such interesting stories, and I'll tell a little more of them next week, so I don't want to give it all away, but essentially these were really important parts of PC in the early years. And in fact, the third guy, who was not the son of Meyer Smith, Maurice Greenstein, he ended up being valedictorian of his class in 1948. And so the connection between the synagogues, the neighborhood, and the school just really struck me through that story. And we kept hearing that story over and over in our interviews. But this one picture really kind of summed up, I think, that relationship.
Oh, that's nice. Well, thank you for sharing both of those. They're both really good stories. And like you said, we don't want to give too much away because it's going to be next week. So with that in mind, I just want to just briefly say what the schedule is. So next Thursday, March 30th at 5 p.m. here in Harkins Hall in the Barnini room is going to be the trailer for Sons of Providence, the Jewish history of Providence College, 1917 to 1965. In fact, our producer, Chris Judge, over here is telling me that we're also going to be live streaming it as well at that time on Facebook. And then on Monday, April 3rd, from 6 to 7:30 p.m., also in the Barnini room, we're going to have the Jewish Catholic Engagement Rhode Island, a panel discussion.
Right. Yeah.
All right.
And I should just also mention the exhibit that goes along with the film will be on display in the admissions welcome area in Harkins through May 5th, I think.
Got it. And if you haven't been to campus before, basically Harkins Hall is the first building you're going to see if you come into the entrance at the corner of River and Eaton. It's straight ahead, and Barnini room is right in the basement. As soon as you walk in, go down the stairs, and there you are. So thank you so much for joining us. This has been fascinating.
Thanks again for the invitation.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks.